as we get into the first part of Leviticus 1. So instead of just stopping and doing review right here, we'll do a bit of review in just a minute. So let's start off by reading Leviticus chapter 1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to offer a male without defect. He must present it at the entrance to the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He is to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and sprinkle it against the altar on all sides of the entrance, on all sides at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest are to put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat, on the burning wood that is on the altar. He is to wash the inner parts and the legs with water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. If the offering is a burnt offering from the flock, from either the sheep or the goats, he is to offer a male without defect. He is to slaughter it at the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle its blood against the altar on all sides. He is to cut it into pieces, and the priest shall arrange them, including the head and the fat, on the burning wood that is on the altar. He is to wash the inner parts and the legs with water, and the priest is to bring all of it and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. If the offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, he is to offer a dove or a young pigeon. The priest shall bring it to the altar, wring off the head, and burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained out on the side of the altar. He is to remove the crop from with its contents and throw it to the east side of the altar where the ashes are. He shall tear it open by the wings, not severing it completely, and then the priest shall burn it on the wood that is on the fire on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord." Okay, so how does the book of Leviticus open in verse 1?
The Lord is speaking to Moses
From where?
from the tent of meeting.
Yes. Okay, now that opening verse is very short, but it is very weighty. So let's talk about the context before we move on. As we saw last week, Leviticus is set in the middle of this larger narrative in between the year, or in the year that's in between the time when the tabernacle's first erected, that's at the end of Exodus, and when it's then dismantled for Israel to continue their journey, that's in Numbers chapter 10. So the last chapter of Exodus described in detail the setting up of the tabernacle, and Leviticus now contains all the procedures for how the tabernacle is going to function. So the first verse of Leviticus picks up where Exodus 40 left off. Now, part of what makes this book a challenge, well, for me, and I assume it's similar for you, is that it's mostly procedural. So there's a lot of detailed instructions about what to do and how to do it, and not a lot of action when it comes to narratives. So the theology of Leviticus is bound up in these rituals and procedures, but that theology is profound, and it's central to the theology of the whole Bible. So here's the thing. At the end of Exodus, for the first time since humanity was expelled from the Garden of Eden, God is dwelling with his people. When the glory of God descends on the tabernacle in Exodus 40, it's a cataclysmic event. Because the Lord's coming to live on earth, it's like the Garden of Eden regained. But there's a problem, because at the end of Exodus, Moses can't go into the tabernacle because of the presence of the Lord. Now, Moses is the chosen mediator. If he can't go in, then who can? If he is excluded, then who can dwell with God? Who can enter his presence? Who can live in his house? That's the issue at the center of Leviticus. So when the Lord speaks in Leviticus, his purpose is to reveal how people can enter his house, how it is that they can live in intimate relationship with him. Now, along those lines, notice something significant in that opening verse. When the Lord calls to Moses, he calls to him from the tent of meeting, and it's the tabernacle, but it doesn't call it that. Why do you think it's significant that he calls the tabernacle here the tent of meeting?
Because it's separated from the most holy place.
So the most holy place is inside the tent of meeting. This is another name for the tabernacle. So the tent of meeting is another name for the tabernacle. But why is it significant that it's called the tent of meeting?
He's making like them.
That's right. Okay, so the tabernacle it's this tent that's the dwelling place of the Lord. But if that's all it is, that doesn't really get his people a whole lot. Like God could stay in his tent isolated from everybody else. But that's not the goal of God dwelling with his people. The goal is not just for him to have a dwelling place, it's for him to have a place where his people can come and meet with him. And so it's intended to be a place where there's fellowship. The ultimate purpose of God dwelling among his people is that they and he will be in fellowship together. So in a sense, the book of Leviticus is about how the tabernacle becomes the tent of meeting. How it is that it becomes a place for God and his people to live in intimate relationship with one another. So more specifically, the problem at the end of Exodus, which is that no one, including Moses, can enter the Lord's dwelling place, that problem is going to be solved in Leviticus, and the way it's going to be solved is by the means of sacrifices and priests. That's how people get into the dwelling place of God.
Sacrifices and what?
Priests.
Priests.
Yeah. So it matters that it will increasingly be called the tent of meeting, because that function, that purpose of the tabernacle is in the forefront of everything that's going on in Leviticus. Okay, now, as we talked about before, there's a lot of symbolism associated with the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. It's symbolism that's supposed to provide illustrations for instructing the people of Israel about who they are, about who their God is, about how they relate to him. And just generally speaking, the tabernacle and the service that's performed there communicate really profound truths about God's presence with them, his holiness, and the covenant relationship that exists between them. So the structure of the tabernacle, we talked about that last week, and the rituals that are prescribed for its function, all of that, it works in a way that's similar to a drama. So what I mean by that is, God communicates truths about his holiness and about people's sinfulness and about the means to approach him and have fellowship with him through this graphic imagery of the priests and the sacrifices and the festival ceremonies. And those truths are going to be portrayed with really tangible vividness that people can see and they can hear and they can touch, they can smell, sometimes they can even taste. So God could have just described all these truths. He could have just told the people how it is, but actually what he does is he puts it in living color through the rituals that he prescribes at the tabernacle. So the rituals are not an end in themselves, they're a teaching tool to point the people to deeper spiritual realities, and they're also a means by which the people demonstrate their trust in the Lord's provision. Participating in the rituals, you could just go through the motions, and there were people who did that. But participation in the rituals is actually intended to be an act of faith, where people express their understanding of what's required to be in relationship with a holy God. So, even though the rituals are foreign to us, they would have been familiar to the Israelites, because the things we're going to see in Leviticus were common practices in the religions and cultures of the ancient Near East. The Lord didn't speak Leviticus into a theological vacuum. He took the typical religious expressions the Israelites would have understood, and he used them to point people to the truth. And by the way, he's not just co-opting like pagan religion. The whole idea of sacrifice goes all the way back to Genesis, like all the way to Genesis 3, really, when you have the God providing the skins for Adam and Eve to cover them when they realize that they're naked. So he's the one who institutes this whole idea of sacrifice. But the pagan religions take sacrifice and use it for their own purposes. What God's doing is he's taking these kinds of worship practices that would have been familiar to the Israelites and everybody else in the ancient Near East, and he's using them to communicate truth to the people. Now we're going to see this in Leviticus. Sometimes he takes a familiar ritual and he affirms it or reinterprets it. Sometimes he introduces a new ritual, and sometimes he just completely prohibits a ritual, depending on what it is that it communicates. Okay, now all that with verse 1. Now what does the Lord say in verse 2?
says your offering needs to be a living entity. It has to be livestock,
It has to be livestock. Okay. Now,
from the herd or from the flock.
right, so meaning cattle, sheep, or goats. Okay, so the word offering is actually derived from the Hebrew word that means to draw near. So an offering is by definition a means of drawing near to God. Now, it's important to note, people do not set the terms for drawing near. They don't decide for themselves what the offerings will be. The Lord is the one who does that, because he's the one who provides the means necessary for people to draw near to him. You know what happens when you leave people to their own devices to decide how they're going to draw near to God? I mean, if you don't know, you just read Exodus, you end up with a golden calf. That's what people do. Because when you're left to your own devices, you create worship systems and gods who tell you what you want to hear, right? Who don't contradict you. Gods you can control, and all your worship practices follow along with that. The Lord does not leave people to decide for themselves how to draw near to him and how to worship him. He makes it very specific how to do that, because he's communicating things about the gospel. That's what he's doing, is he's communicating things about how it is that people can come into his presence through the gospel. We'll come back to that in a minute. But these opening chapters, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, prescribe rituals for 5 different sacrifices. And the first 3 are offerings that are brought as food gifts. They're voluntary offerings, and it says they produce a sweet smelling aroma to the Lord. The last 2 sacrifices are actually offerings required to deal with specific sins. They do not produce a sweet smelling aroma, and we'll talk more about that as we go. Now, not all of the sacrifices involve an animal. We'll see that next week. But most of them do, and for an animal sacrifice, the Lord starts by saying it should be from cattle, sheep, or goats. That excludes wild animals. You can't go hunting for a deer and then offer it to the Lord. Why does that matter?
Well, it's a sacrifice from your own belongings, from your, it's not something he provided.
Well,
It's something he provides, and yet it's something you own,
You know,
right?
yes.
in the Passover celebration, they brought that lamb into their homes.
So they got attached to it, and
So
they
they
named
got-
it before they,
uh-huh.
that's right. My dad always said, don't ever name something you're gonna eat,
Right?
That is true.
Unless it's bologna
Yeah.
for a cow
Or
something like
Or,
that.
or I had a friend who had 2 turkeys they were raising, and they named them Thanksgiving and Christmas. So yeah.
Or T-bone.
Yeah. But there's this idea, because livestock belong to the person, and it makes a difference in the value of the animal to you as the worshiper. So the thing is, you can put in a significant amount of time and finances into hunting elk or deer, but it's different when it's an animal that belongs to you, because you have an investment now in terms of time and work and care and finances, that it's just different. The sacrifice is supposed to be a sacrifice. It's not supposed to be cheap or easy or expedient. There's this place at the end of 2 Samuel where David is going to offer a bunch of burnt offerings when he got himself into a whole mess and the nation into a mess. And he's going to buy this piece of property and then offer these burnt offerings. And the guy who owns the property says, I'll give it to you. I'll give you the property. I'll give you the animals for the burnt offering. And David says, no. He says, I will not offer a burnt offering to the Lord, which costs me nothing. That's important, this idea that it's intended to be something that costs you. That's why it's called a sacrifice. Okay, now, what are the instructions then that the Lord gives about the offering, starting in verse 3?
It has to be without blemish.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Male.
It has to be male. And you notice the name of this first offering. This is a burnt offering, or your translation might say a whole offering. A better translation would actually be a burnt up offering, because the word that's used for this offering is actually related to the word Holocaust. It refers to something that's completely consumed by fire and goes up in smoke. So in a worship ceremony, we'll see the burnt offering wasn't typically the first one offered, but it's mentioned first in the list because it's the most prominent one of all the sacrifices, because of its frequency, its value, and its significance. This is the foundational sacrifice. And this is not only the most common one, but it's the most costly, and it's the only sacrifice that's given entirely to the Lord, where everything, apart from the skin, everything else is burned up and no part of it is eaten by either the priests or the worshipers. Nothing else is discarded. The whole thing goes up in smoke. So this is the essential sacrifice also at the tabernacle. It would have been offered every morning and every evening at the tabernacle and on all of the holy days. Okay, now let's just work through the details a little bit. So again, keep in mind this whole ceremony is intended to be a visual, acted out drama. So each part of the ritual is symbolic. So first off, if it's an offering from the herd, referring to cattle, it has to be a male without defect. Why does it matter that it's male?
There aren't as many of those guys.
That's right. So it's funny that you say that, Jane, because all the commentators are like, we don't really know why it has to be male. And I'm like, that's because you didn't grow up on a farm or a ranch. Like, that's right. I mean, if you have a herd of cattle or a flock of sheep, even if you have chickens, what's the typical proportion of males to females? Like 1, right, for 20 or whatever, right? Even if you have chickens, you don't have 19 roosters and 1 hen.
Right.
You have 1 rooster and 19 hens, and it's the same way with flocks of sheep and the same way with herds of cattle. Of course, if you have loads and loads of cattle, you might have multiple bulls. But if you have a small herd, you have 1 bull with all the cows, right? That means the male is more costly. The male is more valuable because he's harder to replace. You can lose a female animal and still have a whole bunch more, but you lose the male animal, that's a big deal. So the male, it has to be a male because that's the animal that's most costly. And it has to be without defect. Why does that matter?
Because you want something perfect to be given to the Lord.
Why?
Because he's perfect.
Yes, there's that. So one thing is, an animal that has a defect is going to be worth less, right? Not worthless, but worth less.
Oh.
So it's not going to be as valuable, right? So an animal without defect is going to be more valuable. That's one thing. And then the other thing, coming back to what you just said, Liz, is that word that's translated defect or blemish, you can use that word to talk about a person too in a figurative sense, and then it's translated blameless. So, for example, there's a psalm, in Psalm 15 it says, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent, who may live on your holy mountain, the one whose walk is blameless. That word is the same word that's used right here for a blemish or a defect. This animal is symbolic of something else. So the wholeness or the perfection of it is important. And I'm sure you're already starting to think about other things you know that are blameless. We'll come back to that in a minute. So, and just by the way, when we work through this, you'll get the word bull and later the word ram. And when we talk about those animals, when we use a bull or a ram, we're talking about a full-grown animal. But the Hebrew words are they're not age specific. So you could actually bring a calf. You could bring a male calf for this offering, or you could bring a male lamb for this offering too. Okay, so the worshiper brings his animal to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and he presents it to the priest who, it doesn't say here, but the implication is the priest would inspect it and then declare it acceptable or not as a sacrifice to the Lord. That's why when you get to the book of Malachi and the people are bringing defective animals, God gives the priests the what for, because it's the priests who should be stopping that and saying you have to bring an appropriate sacrifice when you come with your animal. Okay, so they come with their animal, and then what do they do in verse 4? Before that, in verse 4.
Lay their hand on it?
They lay their hand on it, and he says, then it will be accepted on your behalf for atonement. Okay, now that ritual is really important because it symbolizes that the worshiper is identifying himself with the animal. So the result of leaning his head on it is to show that this animal is going to stand in for him as his substitute. It's this idea of he declares basically that the animal represents him, which is also why it matters that it's blameless. So he cannot pay the penalty for his sin. Well, he could, but he'll die. And he cannot ascend God's holy mountain, but he's going to do it through the blameless substitute, through this substitute who stands in for him, which is this animal without defect. So through this hand-leading ritual, he establishes this identification with the animal. And it's like the worshiper saying, this represents me. This animal represents me. And it's possible at this point that the worshiper would also tell the priest why he's come. He's got to explain what the sacrifice is for the priest to know what to do. It might be even that he offers a prayer or a psalm or something like that, but whatever the case, the animal is accepted by the Lord to make atonement for the worshiper. Then what does he do in verse 5?
The worshiper slays it.
Yeah, he slaughters this animal. And again, the symbolism is really important. If he's just identified himself with the animal, then what's the picture? The picture is that he himself is dying, and yet there's something that's standing in his place. So there's this willingness. It's an act of willingness to die. Essentially, this way of saying the just penalty for sin should be applied to me. That's what you're getting in this picture, is the worshiper acknowledging and submitting to the righteous judgment of God, and handing himself over. So it's an act, it's a visual picture of self-sacrifice, complete surrender to the Lord and to his judgment. Now the word for slaughter that's used here, it typically refers to killing an animal by cutting its throat. And after that, all the blood would drain out of it. And the priests would use a bowl or a basin to collect up the blood. And then they would splash it against the sides of the altar. Now, my translation says sprinkle. Some of you might have that word too. But the word that's used here doesn't actually mean sprinkle like this. It's a word that actually means to throw it or to splash it or to dash it against the sides of the altar. And it would be a lot of blood. You drain all the blood out of this animal, there's going to be a lot. And you throw it against the side of the altar is essentially going to turn red. It's vivid what's happening, right? And this use of the blood is hugely important, because in Leviticus we're going to see over and over and over, blood is symbolic of life, and it belongs to the Lord. And the Lord is very particular about how it's used because of the symbolism associated with life. And so he absolutely forbids people from misusing blood, of eating it or drinking it or doing any other thing with it that they shouldn't be doing, because it carries this profound picture of a life being applied in the sacrifice. So in chapter 17, verse 11, the Lord says, "The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I myself have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your life, for it is the blood that makes atonement for you." So the use of the blood is really important, and we'll see that over and over as we continue. It also represents cleansing, because life is what removes the stain of death that results from the pollution of sin. Okay, so after he slaughters it, the blood gets thrown against the altar. Then what? In 6 to 9.
You are to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces.
Yes. Then what?
And put fire on the altar and arrange the coal on the fire.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the priests are responsible for the fire. They take all the pieces after the animal's been cut up, including, he says, the head and the fat, arrange them on the fire, and then the worshiper washes the internal organs and the legs with water. That's the parts that would be filthy or contaminated. There's a reason why he's washing that, because that's what would be filthy. And then he hands it all over to the priest, who burns it on the altar. Now, notice the description emphasizes everything is burned up. Everything is. Apart from the skin. We'll see that when we get to chapter 7. But no part of the animal is discarded, and no part of it is eaten. All of it is consumed on the altar. It is a burnt offering, or a burnt up offering, he says. An offering made by fire, or your translation might say a food offering. That imagery actually of a food offering is significant. It's not the idea that God has to be fed by offerings, as if he's dependent on the worshipers, which is actually how a lot of pagan sacrifices were understood. But it's that the offering is completely consumed by the Lord, and the image of Well, using a sacrifice that's edible is important because the image of a meal is going to be really important in the larger context. We'll get to that next week and the week after. But there's a reason why you can't sacrifice your cat. I mean, it's not just because you're attached to your cat. It's there are reasons why they are edible sacrifices. Because there's a meal that stands in the background of all this that we'll get to in chapters 2 and 3. And he says it produces an aroma that pleases the Lord. And again, the imagery is not that the Lord enjoys the smell of roasting meat. It's that the offering is accepted and the completed act of worship pleases him. So when it all goes up in smoke, God is pleased by the worship that is represented in that sacrifice. So there's a lot of important symbolism right there. First, the fact that the whole animal's burnt up. Remember that the worshiper identified himself with the animal. So there's this picture of the worshiper whose whole self is handed over to God in complete surrender and submission to him. And second, the transformation of the animal into smoke that goes up into the air. There's this picture of the life of the worshiper being transformed and going up to the heavenly dwelling place of the Lord.
So Sally, that the worshiper is the one who kills the animal and is involved in all of that?
Yes, it's a little bit ambiguous in the text about who does which parts, but it does sound like, and most of the commentators think it's the worshiper who does all of the cutting, the slitting, the skinning, and then it's the priest who arranges all of the stuff on the altar. But yeah, I mean, put yourself in the place of the worshiper. You put your hand on the head of this animal, you identify yourself with it, and then you cut its throat. It's heavy. Yeah. Okay,
So-
yeah, go ahead.
At the time that they were doing this, I mean, were there specific people that were bringing the sacrifices to them, or were all of the people bringing the sacrifices to the altar?
Well,
How was that?
the people themselves would be the ones bringing the sacrifice, although
They would each bring one?
Every family
I would say
member?
family. So typically what you see is the head, when it comes to a burnt offering, you would typically see the head of a family bring it.
Okay.
But of course you could bring more than one. You could bring multiple offerings for for multiple people. And it's not like people are bringing burnt offerings every day.
Okay.
So like when you get to 1 Samuel, for example, and the story of Hannah, Hannah and her family only went to the tabernacle once a year,
Okay.
right? So they would go once a year and make all of their offerings on that day. And how many they would offer for all the different people, I don't really know. But there's not this idea that every time, that you're bringing a burnt offering every day to the tabernacle, every person. No, it's,
Okay.
yeah. For one thing, most people didn't have that many animals.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah. Okay, now, what's described then in 10 to 13?
It's a similar process, but the sacrificial animal is a sheep
Right, or a goat.
or goat.
Right.
Or a goat.
That's right. So again, it could be a full-grown sheep, could be a lamb, but it still is, it has to be a male and it has to be without defect, and everything else is basically the same. It mentions here the north side of the altar, and I don't know why. So,
It also, is this the one that also mentions something on the east, or is that the bird?
well, the bird mentions stuff getting thrown to the east. So,
Yeah.
just in thinking about the arrangement, I think this is in the diagram that I gave you, but just the arrangement of things. If you're standing on the north side of the altar, to the west would have been the wash basin and the tabernacle, and to the east would have been the ash pit. Maybe there's some symbolism in having the presence of the Lord on the worshiper's right side, because the right is prominent, but I don't really know. I'm not certain why it matters that you're on the north side instead of the south side. Probably there's a reason the Israelites knew that we don't, and this isn't the last time that's going to happen in Leviticus. So, yeah. Okay, now, then 14 to 17. What's that about?
The bird opening.
That's right. So it's a repeat of the previous instructions, but now it's with a bird as the offering. And again, it's not a wild bird. The birds that are listed here are the kinds of birds that would have been raised for food. So this is a domestic bird, and the ritual is basically the same, but there's some modifications because of the size and the anatomy of the bird. So again, the blood is drained out from the neck on the altar. All the unclean parts are removed and discarded. Your translation might say the crop and the feathers, or it might say the crop and the contents. The reason for that difference is there's a Hebrew word there that they don't quite know what it means. So it's either the crop and everything in it, or it might be the feathers. But the point is you're taking the stuff that's unclean. And right here, it's discarded. Like the whole of that is discarded next to the altar. And then instead of being cut up, the bird is pulled apart at the wings, but not completely severed. Now, it doesn't explain the reason for that here. I'm not sure, but I think that this has some connections to the covenant rituals that would have been familiar to the Israelites. Because if you read back in Genesis, when God makes this covenant with Abraham and he tells Abraham to bring the animals for this covenant making ceremony, one of the things it says is that he brings these birds, but he doesn't sever them. And so I don't know why that's significant, but I think the reason they don't sever it here is because that would have been typical in a covenant making ceremony, to leave it not completely cut up the bird. But that's speculation on my part. I'm not certain about that.
What does it mean to tear the wings without separating?
So you're pulling it apart in the middle. So you're breaking it apart in a sense, but without pulling it all the way apart.
So probably from the back, so that the wings
I would
are-
think so. Yeah.
I mean, I typically think of, chicken, you cut it down the breastbone and fly it that way, but this seems like you're separating the two wings.
Yes.
So that they,
Yeah.
it's gross.
And again, why it matters, I'm not sure, but I would guess that there's some ritual stuff in the background that the Israelites would have understood, or they would have known this is typically how you do it, like in a covenant making ceremony or
So
something.
they don't clean it out like they do the.
They clean out the crop,
Crop with its feathers.
so that, the unclean bit inside, they clean that out
Okay.
and then burn the rest of it. Yeah.
So sacrificing the birds, that was like Mary and Joseph. If you're poor, you bring birds.
It's like you knew what I was about to say.
And then, what was it? And you could buy them, right? They were for sale.
At the time, when you get to the New Testament, at the time when people are coming to the temple in the time of Jesus, yes, because there were people who lived a long ways away from
Oh,
Jerusalem.
That makes
And so if you're going to
sense.
go on a long trip, like for Passover, it's a lot easier to buy an animal when you get to Jerusalem than it is to bring it all the way there.
And that was still acceptable.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. But that would be less of an issue now with the tabernacle because everybody's living right there and you would bring the animals that you have.
All million of them.
Yes. So my next question was going to be, why are there 3 different offerings listed and in this order? Because there are 3 different provisions that are based on a person's financial situation, from the most valuable to the least valuable. So the thing is, for us, meat is an everyday food, right? I mean, sometimes more than every day. Sometimes you eat it 3 times a day. For the ancient Israelites, it was very different. Meat was a luxury for most people, and you ate it very rarely, unless you were very wealthy. So to watch an entire animal go up in smoke, with no part of it used for food, that was not a small thing for an Israelite. That was enormous.
Huge fat sacrifice.
Yes, it was. And someone who was wealthy could bring a bull. Someone who was poor could bring a bird. Probably most of the Israelites fell somewhere in the middle. And because the lambs seem to be the sacrifice that shows up the most often when you read through the Old Testament. So I would guess most people were, they were
Middle class.
middle class. That's right. I was about to say middle-aged, and I'm like, that's not right. That's right, that they're middle class and they bring lambs. So, and again, notice in the law that it doesn't say if you own a bull, you have to bring it. The law doesn't tell you that. You could have 1 bull and 5 rams, and it's up to you. If you want to bring a ram, you're free to do that. If you want to bring a lamb instead of a calf, you're free to do that. It's up to the worshiper to decide what it is that they're going to take for this burnt offering. And God, everybody has access to the Lord through this offering. He's not more accessible to the wealthy. He's not less accessible to the poor. He doesn't despise small offerings. Now, having said that, that you have some leeway as the worshiper to decide what you're going to take. I think that if someone like King Solomon showed up at the temple with a pigeon, that the priest would have said, I don't think so. Right? Even though the law doesn't say what you have to bring, isn't there this idea that if you are the wealthiest man who's ever lived in Israel, and you're bringing the absolute cheapest offering you can bring, something's not right, right?
It feels like that goes back to Cain and Abel, like where one was acceptable and one wasn't.
Yeah, and it's the faith. It's whatever's represented by the worship or not. That's what makes the difference. And the Lord doesn't spell it all out in black and white to say, okay, if you have this much money, you have to bring this sacrifice. No, he lets the worshiper think through that and decide for themselves what they're going to bring. But for someone like Solomon to bring a bird is basically bringing something that costs him nothing, right? I mean, he's not even going to miss it. And for the Lord, the worship, part of what's involved in the worship is taking something that actually makes a difference if you give it up. It should matter that you hand it over. It shouldn't be something that you don't even miss it, when it's gone.
Sally,
Mhm.
at this point, like, they've recently come out of Egypt, right? And so they're in the wanderings, they've not yet reached the promised land, so are they still being provided manna?
Mm-hmm.
And they have all of these animals that they have the ability to, like, how does that all?
Yes. So again, yes, they are being fed by manna, and they haven't been cursed with the 40 years in the wilderness yet. So if they had done what they were supposed to do, when they leave Mount Sinai, they would be at the land, they would be at Canaan within a matter of weeks. But then, what happens along the way? Well, they get there and then they won't go in, and so then they end up wandering for 40 years. So at this point, yes, they're being fed by the manna and the quail, but they would have had livestock with them. And my impression is that generally they're not eating the livestock. So you're holding on to the livestock because you get milk from the livestock, because it's your savings. That's what you're going to depend on when you get to the land of Canaan, is these herds that you've brought with you. That's going to be what sustains you. And so you might eat an animal every once in a while, but you wouldn't be eating, lamb every week, because you just can't afford to be killing off your animals in the wilderness like that.
Because don't they want them to multiply?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
they want to be able to.
Yeah. And then when we get to the offering next week, which is a grain offering, somebody asked, well, where are they getting grain from? And I'm like, I don't know. I really don't, because you have to grow it, and they're not growing it if they're wandering in the wilderness. So there might be this implication that, you have a little bit of this now, whatever you brought from Egypt, or whatever you can trade for or buy from with people. There's trade caravans that go through the wilderness. So you could buy things, but a lot of these offerings are going to be a lot easier to do when they get to the land of Canaan, because then they're going to have fields, they're going to have places to live where they can settle with their animals, and yeah. So that's my impression, is they're being fed by the manna and the quail, and they're using their herds for sacrifices, not necessarily for food. Although of course once in a while you could. Passover, you're going to have something to eat after you sacrifice the Passover lamb. Yeah? Okay. What sorts of things are emphasized in those instructions?
Cleanliness
So the idea that you're using blood for
for a sacrifice.
a sacrifice and to
Yeah.
cleanse things. Yep. What else?
Precise steps. Very, very precise.
It is very precise. God is very particular about the rituals, and I know that, as we continue through the sacrifices, there's a lot of repetition in these instructions, and sometimes that repetition can get a little tedious, but I don't want to skip it, because the more familiar you become with those components of the sacrifice, the more quickly you'll recognize when something changes. And when something changes, it's significant. When the ritual changes, there's something that changes in the symbolism. It's accomplishing a different purpose. So yes, God is very particular about the steps that they take, the order that they do them, because all of this is communicating things that are about a spiritual reality. Yeah. What else? Anything else stand out to you?
Locations for disposal on the east side or the west side or.
Yes, and,
wherever.
and we'll talk more about that later, about what you do with the remains of an animal, how you handle the remains of something that's been given to the Lord, because it's holy. And you can't just do with it whatever you want. Like, it matters how you handle all of that stuff that's been brought as a sacrifice. Anything else?
The aroma is pleasing to the Lord.
Yeah, keeps getting repeated, that idea that this act of worship is something that pleases God. Yeah. Okay, now what's the purpose of this offering?
Worship.
Yes, it's worship, and there's something more specific. Atonement. So the short answer is atonement. Now let's talk for a minute about atonement. We talked about it a little bit last week. Atonement means at one meant. So it's this term that refers to whatever's necessary to bring God and people together, to put them into relationship. That's the point of the tent of meeting. So it's to make them at one. So in particular, atonement involves two major concepts. This was in the handout, the extra handout that I gave you, so if you read that, this is going to sound a little familiar. There are two major concepts involved in atonement. The first one is the concept of ransom, that your life is forfeit because of your sin, but it's bought back in the sense that there's a substitute who takes your place and dies the just penalty that you deserve. And the second concept is the idea of cleansing, that your sin and impurity have to be erased. Okay, now those are the two major topics that are covered by atonement, but you can break those things down even further. So ransom and cleansing involve satisfying God's justice and his wrath, which the theologians call propitiation. It involves removing your sin and your uncleanness, which they call expiation. It involves declaring you righteous, like justification, in order for you to be reconciled to God, to be accepted by him, and to be at peace with him, to be at one. Sometimes the word atonement is used in a general way that encompasses all of that. Sometimes it's used just to refer to a particular aspect of that process, like the ransom or the propitiation or the cleansing. The context is what provides clues to make the meaning clear. It's important to note that atonement is not our provision paid to God. It's his provision paid on our behalf, and we take hold of it by faith. Now, the reason I say that is because when we talk about atonement in the culture, when you say, someone's going to atone for what they did, what we typically mean by that is you did something you shouldn't have, and now you've got to pay the price, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to do something to make up for the bad thing that you did. Biblically, when you bring a sacrifice of atonement, it's not that the sacrifice is your payment to God for your sin. It's that the sacrifice is a symbol of God's payment for your sin, which is why he's so particular about the details. It's an illustration of how God is going to provide the means for us to be at one with him. Now, because of the broad range of symbolism, there's a whole lot of symbolism in this sacrifice. Because of that broad range of symbolism, it was used on a whole variety of occasions. Even before the law's given, this is a sacrifice that was familiar to people. So it's the sacrifice that Noah offered after the flood. It's the sacrifice Abraham was commanded to make with Isaac. This is the sacrifice that's going to be offered every morning and every evening at the tabernacle and later at the temple. And also on every Sabbath, on the first of every month, on all the festival days. And because it includes this image of ransom, people would bring it in context of repentance or redemption. Because of the image of cleansing, people would bring it in context of physical or spiritual purification. Because of the image of the worshiper's whole life being given over to God, people brought it in contexts where they were taking vows, or they were dedicating something to the Lord, or where they had significant prayer requests or praises. The imagery of the burnt offering made it appropriate for almost every occasion of worship to the Lord. So it's very common, and it's very foundational. Okay, now, I wonder if you've noticed some parallels with Jesus. Okay, tell me how.
He bears our sin as a sin offering and takes our place.
That's right.
He's without blemish.
That's right.
Sinless.
That's right. So one of the reasons why all those details matter is because it's pointing you ahead to the sacrifice of Christ. That's why it matters that you get all of those things right, because it's communicating something about the final sacrifice who's coming. And when you get to the New Testament, there are verses like Ephesians 5:2. Paul says, Christ gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. There it is. like the New Testament writers just say, yeah, he is the burnt offering. Or in Romans 3:25, he says, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. There it is again, that idea of the burnt offering, and that it's Christ who accomplishes atonement for us. Jesus is our ransom. He's the one who takes our place. When you think about ransom, I think typically in our culture when we talk about ransom, well, what's the kind of context where somebody would pay a ransom? Kidnapping.
Ransom of Little Red Chief. Ransom of Little, remember that story?
No.
No? It's a ransom of Little Chief, yeah. I think the first of the name. It's
Okay.
very, it's a fantastic old classic. Of Little Red-
It's probably not politically correct anymore, though.
Probably not, but nothing is.
So when you think about like kidnapping, I mean, paying a ransom is kind of infuriating, isn't it? Because who gets paid?
The bad guy.
The bad guy gets paid, and it's the victim or some representative of the victim who pays. It's just so infuriating. So what's the purpose of the ransom in a kidnapping?
Freedom.
To buy back the life of the person, right? Because typically what you say is you pay the ransom or they die. So there's this innocent person, their life is forfeit, you pay the ransom or they're dead. And so the victim or some representative of the victim pays it to the perpetrator. Now, under the Old Testament law, there's a way that ransom is used a little differently. So, for example, in Exodus 21, the first time that ransom is referred to in the law, it's in a situation where there's a guy who's a bull owner, say. He's got this bull, and his bull gets out one day, and it kills the woman who lives next door. And so what the law says is, if he had no idea that the bull was dangerous, and this bull, kills his neighbor, it's curtains for the bull. They execute the bull, but the man is not held responsible. However, if the bull was dangerous, and he knew that it was dangerous, and he didn't do anything to keep it in, or to keep it, away from other people, and it goes next door and kills the woman who's his neighbor, now he's guilty of negligent homicide. And the penalty for negligent homicide is execution. It's a capital crime. But because it's not premeditated, it's possible for the judge to say, instead of you being executed, you can pay a certain price, there's a certain amount of money you could pay, and you can ransom your life back. So the man who's guilty has the option of buying back his own life. Okay, so think about how that's different. It's the perpetrator who's paying, and he's paying because his life is forfeit to the just penalty of the law. But he can buy his life back so that he doesn't have to die. Okay, now, let me give you a hypothetical situation. Let's say you have a guy who owns a bull. His bull's dangerous. He knows it's dangerous. He doesn't really take care of it. It gets out one day, kills the neighbor woman. He goes to court, and he's guilty of negligent homicide. So the judge says, okay, I'm going to have mercy on you. You can pay this price, pay this amount of money, and then you won't be executed. And the man says, thank you very much. That's very merciful of you, and I appreciate it. But the fact is, I don't have the money. Like there's just no amount of money that I could pay. Here's the amount, but I don't have it. I can't pay it. So, the mercy's nice, but I'm going to die anyway. And the woman's husband says, it's okay. I will pay the price for you. Who would ever do that? Right? That's what Christ does. Christ is the one, God is the one who's been wronged, right? We are the perpetrators, and we have wronged the Lord. And your life is forfeit, rightly forfeit to the just penalty of God's law. And what could you pay to get your life back? Nothing even comes to mind, does it? Right? There's no amount of money you could pay to redeem yourself from the just penalty of God's law. So what does God do? As the one who's been wronged, he steps in and pays what you owe. And he does it not by giving an amount of money, but by taking the sentence of execution that you deserve. Right? He dies in your place.
And the difference from Leviticus, they had to keep doing that, but Jesus was once for all.
That's right. So when Jesus says he's come not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, I think the Jews would have understood that against the background of the Old Testament law, which is to say he's come to pay the price that you rightly should pay, but he's going to take your place. He's going to be the substitute to buy your life back. So Jesus is your ransom, and it's the blood of Jesus that provides your cleansing, the removal of sin, and the death that comes with it. And because of all that, Jesus has provided reconciliation. So now we have access to God. We're at peace with him. We can ascend his mountain. We can rest in his garden. We can live in his house. We can have intimate relationship with him. We can be at one with him, not just temporarily, but permanently, like you just said. Okay, so now think about that and put yourself in the place of the worshiper in Leviticus and imagine that scene. So the next time you're sitting in church and you hear about the blood of Jesus shed for you, about him being your ransom, about his death on the cross, cleansing and saving you, here's the Old Testament background for all of that, with all of the graphic images that go along with it. So there's this hymn that we sing at church a lot, and I don't know if you know it. It's in the Trinity hymnal, but it's by Isaac Watts, of course, and it's called "Not All the Blood of Beasts." Okay, so let me read it for you. It says, "Not all the blood of beasts on Jewish altars slain could give the guilty conscience peace or wash away the stain. But Christ, the heavenly Lamb, takes all our sins away, a sacrifice of nobler name and richer blood than they. My faith would lay her hand on that dear head of thine, while like a penitent I stand and there confess my sin." Okay, did you catch what he just said? Whose head does he put his hand on? Jesus. So in that image, I mean, imagine yourself as the worshiper and you put your hand on the head of Christ. You identify with him, and what happens next?
Tortured.
He gets slaughtered. And the blood that drains out on the ground should be yours, but it's not. It's his, right? So Isaac Watts keeps going. He says, "My soul looks back to see the burdens you did bear when hanging on the cursed tree and knows my guilt was there. Believing we rejoice to see the curse removed. We bless the Lamb with cheerful voice and sing his bleeding love." I mean, he just looks at something like the sacrifice of Leviticus 1 and he sees the gospel just in living color. But it is graphic, and it's intended to be. Because, we have a very sanitized version, maybe less so in Wyoming because, you could go to a slaughterhouse and see all of that stuff, or if you go hunting, you know how bloody things are. But think about this, where when you come to worship and you're confessing your sin, or you're coming and acknowledging that you're on the wrong side of God, and the only way to be made right with God is through this sacrifice of atonement. It's going to be a graphic sort of picture of the gospel, to put your hand on the head of this animal and to slaughter it, and to know that's what's necessary for you and God to be at one. And that's what Christ did for us. He became the animal that substitutes for us. He's the one who stands in our place. Now, it doesn't stop there, because then Paul says in Romans 12, "Therefore I urge you, in view of God's mercy, in view of the gospel, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." Now that's really interesting. He says, in light of what Christ has done in becoming your burnt offering, now turn around and offer yourself to God. Now you can't accomplish what Christ accomplished, but that's not what Paul's getting at. What do you think he means by that when he says, okay, now offer yourself as the offering?
Be obedient.
How obedient?
Lay down your
How
life.
much?
And take up your cross.
That's right. Like your whole life gets handed over, right? That's the picture in the burnt offering, is you hand your whole self over to God. And I think that's what Paul is getting at is, you want to talk about now living for God, it's be obedient, and it's your whole self. It's deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. You hand it all over to him. And Paul says that's the right response to what Christ has done. In fact, that's the only appropriate response to what Christ has done is you hand yourself over and you say, okay, now I belong to you. I belong wholly to the Lord, but you're a living sacrifice. So now it is about obedience, it's about how you live, it's about where your priorities are, and that the gospel now redefines everything. Okay, I've been talking a lot. Are there comments, things you would like to add?
I was in the study once where she said, it's a living sacrifice, you can crawl off the altar.
So don't do that, right?
You think that the Jews would have recognized when Christ was presented as the Lamb of, behold, the Lamb of God? You think that had been a clue for them? Or perhaps it was for many of them, for the ones who followed him.
Because it's John the Baptist who says that.
Yeah.
So right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, here's John saying, there's the sacrifice. That's right. Mm-hmm.
How does this work in this picture? They never go in the tent.
They don't.
They present the animal before the tent.
On the bronze altar, yes.
And this is the altar.
Okay.
Does it burn all the time it's set up?
Yeah, we're actually going to get to that in chapter 7.
Do they
that
ever
they're
clean the blood out to transport
Well, they
it?
transport it, so some of the blood's gonna probably.
Yeah, I don't know what happens when they pick it up and carry it around, but I do know that they keep the fire as long as it's set up. The fire has to be burning all the time.
You know, I
Night and day.
kept, that part really bothered me was the cleanliness. I know they left the blood on the side, drained it, and then I kept thinking about my fireplace, my wood stove. The hotter the fire is, the cleaner the window. Does that help?
So in the sense that if you have fire there, that might be part of
If
what
that
cleanses
fire
the
is
altar.
all the time
Cleanses it.
burning, and it's a hot fire,
Mhm.
it takes all the creosote and takes it off the window of my wood stove.
Kind of like how you clean your oven by just turning it up
Yeah,
super hot.
Yeah, so in my mind I thought, well, that must be what it was.
But maybe
I
that's
don't
the
know.
point, maybe having it be so bloody and so, I mean, can you imagine like every time we sinned that we had to literally kill something and have blood splashed everywhere? Like how long would it take for us to be like, yeah, I'm not doing that thing, because then you know what I mean? Like maybe that's part of it, is it's not clean.
And when
It is.
it talks about wringing the neck of the chicken, you do that and you cut the chicken's neck off and it bleeds all over, it runs all over and bleeds. I'm just so visual.
These are turtle doves though, so they're much smaller. They're not
She's
gonna
trying
be
to
that
visualize.
big.
I'm just
Yeah.
visualizing in my strange mind,
But back to
Maybe that's why they
that.
split the wing, because then
Yeah.
then it can't.
That's true.
That's
Fly
possible.
around.
Yeah.
But back to what you said, Laura, is how flippant are we
Yeah.
about the sacrifice of Christ? If you had to take a sacrifice like that, I think it would make you a bit sober in your worship. You know, just the graphicness of that and how real it is that something has to die in my place. You wouldn't talk about the blood of Jesus in any way that's casual or flippant. Yeah. And I think that's the point, is God wants to make it very clear to the people, this is serious business. like they know it, but when you have to go through it yourself, it's serious. Yeah. I saw a hand. Somebody else. Yeah.
How often did they move? Because
Whenever
you'd have
the-
giant piles of ashes and giant piles of skins.
They moved whenever God told them to.
Okay.
So
They followed
it might have been a
they
couple
followed
weeks,
the
it might have
cloud.
been, they did. So it might have been a couple
Fire.
months, might have been a couple weeks, might have been longer than that. Yeah.
Could manna be part of the grain offering?
No.
No,
No.
because it dissolves.
And we'll talk about.
There's no sacrifice.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, yeah, the grain offering. There's no sugar, no anything in the grain offering, which is very interesting. One of the things too that I'll just throw in, because I gotta stop talking, but there's one other thing I want to mention. I've just been thinking in the last week about that episode in the gospel accounts where Jesus is sitting in front of the temple where people are coming and bringing their offerings and they're throwing their money in. And Jesus is watching all these people, and there's this widow woman who comes and puts in 2 copper pennies. And when Jesus sees her do that, he says she gave more than all the others did because she gave out of her poverty and they gave out of her wealth. And then he says, well, my translation says everything she had to live on. But what he actually says is her whole life. So she came with these 2 copper pennies, put them in, and Jesus says, and she just handed her whole life over. I think for a Jew hearing that, you would think in the background of the burnt offering. That idea that here's somebody who did exactly what's being, even without all the blood and sacrifice, here's a woman whose act of worship is saying, okay, God, you get it all. Like, and when it's like it's not that you get all my possessions, it's you get me. And here I am. It's a really interesting kind of imagery of when we come to worship, are we offering God stuff or are we offering God ourselves? Because that's what he wants, is he wants our worship. He wants us to offer him ourselves. Yeah. Okay, any last things that you want to throw out before we? Okay, we will stop. Good, you survived chapter 1, well done.